Olá, bem-vindos a mais um vídeo da Hora Suave. Hoje estamos ao lado de John Higgins, artista colorista de quadrinho. First of all, Mr. Higgins, it's absolutely wonderful to be interviewing you. It's a great honor. And I would like to ask you, nowadays, we see the name of the colorist on the cover of magazines, on Marvel, on DC, and that's something that we didn't have like 10, 15 years ago. How do you see this position of the market to the colorist? Now, you are a very important piece of this work, and your name is on the cover. How do you see it?
I think when I first started in the industry with Watchmen Killing Joke, the colorist wasn't considered. I mean, Dave and Alan wanted me to be part of the creative process, and they allowed me to do that. And funnily enough, the question you just asked, I was speaking to one of the publicists in DC a short while ago, a few years ago, and he said I was the person who changed that appreciation of the colorist. And the reason now colorists get proper recognition and also proper financial reward for being part of a very successful title. So I feel very, very strong about the fact that a colorist should be acknowledged as a full part of the creative process. So to see names on the covers of colorists, and you get to recognise great colorists because they are acknowledged with the other creators. So it's brilliant. I think it's superb.
And you talked about Watchmen. Watchmen is a comic book that has a huge impact on the industry. How was for you while you were working on it, did you already notice that, this will be a very major thing? Or how do you see Watchmen like now, 40 years later, and the impact that it had on the industry?
Dave and Alan and I, we thought we were doing something interesting and different, and so did the editors at the time, the individual editors, but it wasn't particularly recognised by the broader management at DC. And it was only around the second and third issue when the sales figures actually started going up. The first issue sold something like 80,000 copies, which was very good for DC in those days. They were always slightly behind Marvel. Marvel regularly sold 100,000, 200,000, sort of Spider-Man, something like that. And DC never really reached those figures. But when Watchmen, which was an independent and prestige book, they had different formats. And when it started reaching, close to 100,000 copies a month, management started sitting up and taking notice. And one of the things they did start doing was promoting it in a really big way. They started doing buttons with the smiley face one, which is obviously a perfect interpretation to promote something that has a smiley face on the first cover. So things like that. As I said, Dave and Alan and I thought it was going to be something interesting, special, but we had no idea it was going to still be here 40 years later. It's just blown us all away. We were really, really pleased about it. I think when Dave and Alan in particular, I think Dave has always had his finger on the pulse of things, whereas Alan went on to other projects very, very soon after the success of Watchmen, and he just went from success to success, and so did Dave. And I went off on different projects because I've always been more than a colorist, so I had my own projects to deal with. But Dave has always made sure that Watchmen was in the forefront when he was dealing with DC or any other company, and because of the critical acclaim, he didn't really need to try that hard to do it. When the collected edition started selling, 5, 10, 15, 20,000 copies every year, and it kept selling and kept selling and kept selling.
To this day, right?
Watchmen
is on the most sold comics every month.
Oh, I didn't know it was every month, but because you don't really keep abreast of what DC are doing with it. I know my studio is packed floor to ceiling with different editions of Watchmen, and it's great for me because it keeps the walls up, basically. So heavy, But no, it's really good fun to be involved with something that at the very beginning of my career that had such a longevity and such acknowledgement from a wider, not only in comics, but I think it was voted one of the top 100 most successful novels of the 20th century. Not graphic novel, but novels.
By the Times.
That's right, yeah. So to actually reach an audience beyond the wonderful world of comics is just lots of creators just dream of doing that.
This week I was reading some of your work on Marvel, like Scarlet Witch and all these things, and I would like to ask you, as a colorist, when you do a comic book art and you see other person coloring your work, do you feel like, oh, he could do it better, or he did it better than I would do? Do you have this kind of thought when you just draw and you see other person coloring it?
In the early days, yes. I think because I had very strong sense of what I want to do with colour from Watchmen, and before Watchmen I was always a colour artist. That's why they asked me to do Watchmen Killing Joke. And even when I'm drawing something, I know the direction of the colour. You know, if it's obvious if it's night, or it's obvious if it's day. You want something that's going to reflect that. And if it's sophisticated enough, in the early days when I was doing stuff for Marvel, we didn't really have much digital colouring. You know, computer colouring really came in probably the mid to late 90s. And even then, sort of like, you know, there was very few professional colourists who were doing digital colour work. I mean, it was just it's changed so much in my career time sort of thing. So I did have a lot of reservations about people colouring my work, but now there's so many brilliant colourists out there. You know, there's so many superb professional colourists that want their work to be the best possible work that it can be, and they can just... The thing I've always loved about comics is that the way the creative production line, this, like the fact that when collaborators get together and they're given the freedom by the editorial staff to actually come together as a group. And I think if you're dealing with the colourists, you can talk things through. I did some projects where we used different colourists. I think Jacked was a thing I did for one of the last things DC Vertigo did. And Eric Kripke, the creator of Supernatural, and I think he's the showrunner on The Boys. Yeah. Very high-profile comics projects. And the deadline was really, really tight because DC was in the process of moving from Gotham City, New York to Burbank, California, which I always sort of like have a problem with. I just thought it was the worst thing that like a company could do, you know.
But more of a movie company than...
Yes, you actually put your finger on it exactly. It should have stayed a comics publisher, and just, okay, projects can be made out of any of the characters, and they prove that time and time again. And obviously Marvel's proved it better than anyone else. But yeah, I've forgotten your question.
About other colorists coloring your work.
Yeah, no, in the early days it was I had a major problem with it, but now I actually live with my colorist. Oh. You know, my wife now colours my work, and Sally Jane Hurst. It's great because it's unlikely that she's going to get anything wrong, because we talk things through in great detail. And because I'm sort of like the head of the studio, then it doesn't get out the studio until I'm happy with it. So that's great when you work that closely with someone. And because of the people who use me, the publishers that use me, they tend to know we come as a full package. So I will supply the colour as well as the story and the art sort of thing. So that's always good.
And you did a lot of work for Judge Dredd. There is a very political comic, you know, a parody of the England during the 80s and Thatcher and all of those things. And you have a lot of comic book fans here in Brazil, and they see in the US and England, they talk about, oh, I like my comics, but I don't like politics on it. And I think that every comic has its politics. And Judge Dredd is obvious, you know, but how do you see, like, people who can read comics, they can read X-Men and they don't understand? There is a view about minorities and rights, and Judge Dredd is about extreme politics, far-right politics, and they just don't see it, they just see the action. How can you not see that in Judge Dredd, you know? Do you see that in the public, in the audience?
I think that's the really interesting thing about Dredd. The countries that it's popular in is mainly Europe and ex-British colonial nations like Australia, New Zealand, South Africa and so on. And they have a certain sort of mindset, and Brazil, I think, even though it was nothing to do with the British colonial system, there's a certain sort of sensibility that for some reason America decided they were going to have their own way of looking at politics, and we know like some of the monsters that have come out of American politics. Names don't need to be mentioned, but There's something about America, it had such power after the Second World War, even though it didn't have a colonial past, or it had sort of like lots of dependencies, shall we say, of different colonies that were sort of like part of the states, basically, so like Hawaii and sort of like Puerto Rico and so on and so forth. So they were sort of like influencing the world in a slightly different way to the way the British and other colonial powers did in the 18th century. 19th century. So the way this American politics goes is very insular and very internal, whereas a lot of what the colonial powers did, to a certain extent, is too big a debate to go into, but a lot of the democracies around the world came from the European system, whereas the Americans, because of the way they built their individual states, it came together in a different way. So you have federal and local politics, and it's just a two-horse race always within America. It's either Republicans or the Democrats. Yeah, whereas in smaller Britain's a very small country, and lots of European countries are very small compared to Brazil or lots of South American nations, and obviously Canada, probably to a certain extent, is slightly closer to the British way of democracy than certainly America is. So yes, you're right. The humour that the Americans don't seem to get. That's why Dread works around the world in a lot of ways, because the politics is satirical, and there's a great sense of humour, no matter how violent Dread is. And particularly when it was written originally by John Wagner and Alan Grant and some of the early. Well, they're the creators. They was showing politics in a way, as you say, reflected what we were seeing happening in Britain, and it was becoming more conservative, more fascistic, which is something that you found students and sort of liberal arts establishments, if there is an establishment in the arts, because it can't be liberal otherwise. But anyway, we had a way of looking at things that we wanted to puncture the pomposity of the political classes. And the thing with America is the fact they love success, and even if it's, I don't even want to mention his name, but even if you look at someone like Trump, there's a lot of America who love the fact that, I can't even say it because he's never been successful, he's always failed, but let's not get into too much politics.
Yeah. My final question for you, we see a lot of people coming here with the Killing Joke for you to sign, and in recent years they changed the colors. Brian Boland did the colors, the actual colors. Someone reached you and said, we're going to change the colors. How did you feel about it? Because personally I like her version more.
Thank you.
And I think I didn't see why they had to change it. Someone approached you, someone talked to you, or they just changed it? How do you felt about it?
The interesting thing about that is because I changed the way colorists were considered and paid, in particular, the payment is the driving force of what we all do. You obviously love what you do, you're an artist, you're a creative person, but you still have to pay the bills, and the taxman in particular. The best thing that I got out of the Killing Joke was I unfortunately suffered from the crossover from where you weren't contracted to earn any additional remuneration. It didn't happen until after I'd completed the Killing Joke, and then they put in place all of the additional rewards. It's not royalties, you just get additional rewards if something sells over so many copies, 60,000 copies a month or whatever. I lost out financially, should we say. Don't want to go into details, but one of the pleasures was the fact that I was involved in such an incredibly creative team. Brian Boland and Alan Moore, obviously, just acknowledged master of comics writing at that particular time. And I was involved with them, and it was good for me. It raised my profile massively, and I got a credit on the cover. And then one day I was walking into a local bookstore in Britain, and a new edition of Killing Joke, and I hang on, my name's not on the cover anymore. And I looked inside, and it turned out to be Brian Boland's colouring. And that's the first time I knew that I'd been replaced as the colourist on The Killing Joke. No one rang me from DC, no one said, sorry, but Brian, I always knew Brian wanted to recolour it, which is fine. I have no problem with him doing that. I have no problem with him doing the colouring that he did. What problem I have is the fact that DC didn't tell me.
Well, they should.
I'd worked with DC for 30 years, and they didn't have the courtesy to tell me that The Killing Joke, the biggest selling Batman novel ever, which is still selling thousands and thousands of copies a year, they're not going to credit me anymore. And so it was a bit of pill. And I told them, and I told Brian, I have no problem, because Brian was concerned. Brian is such a lovely, lovely, friendly man and a brilliant artist, and he was concerned that I was upset. And I was never been upset with Brian. I was upset with DC's discourtesy of not giving me an acknowledgement to say, this is what's happening. But subsequent to that, they did apologise for that, and they did do the Absolute edition where they allowed me to actually have an editorial to express my opinion and what I felt about everything, which is so generous for a big company like that. And then they've reissued my colouring just this year, again with my editorial. So they've certainly acknowledged the discourtesy, at least, since that particular incident, and things have changed, and now my colouring is back on the bookshelves, and I'm very pleased and very proud to be associated with it again.
Mr. Higgins, thanks for talking to us.
It's been a pleasure.
It was
Thank
an
you for
honor.
asking
Thank you very much.
Questions.
Thank you.
Appreciate
Hope
it.
you enjoy your stay here in Brazil.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, Brazil. Goodbye, Brazil.